Tonight with Craig's talk and the research part of this, we want to bring the research in, the science of it in as much as possible, but we also have to bring in our anecdotal experiences in and day out and seeing people in the clinic and things that we know tend to work. So that to us is also almost research. So as we're going through that research stuff, if you have a question about the specific topic or research article he's talking about, I would just suggest you go ahead and ask your question. We'll leave a little time at the end for some question and answers, but with that I'll turn it over to Craig and we'll get going. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, before I start, I wanted to say thanks to Steve and Runners Roost for coming out here. They do a lot for the running community with us, so that's just awesome that they can come out and talk about some shoes. So thanks to you guys. But yeah, my name is Craig Depperschmidt. I'm a physical therapist here at Rebound in this Fort Collins clinic. And running's been a big part of my whole life. I ran, born and raised in Loveland, ran for Loveland High out there, and then ran all throughout college and did a bunch of local races here. So running's just the running community. It's been a big part of my life. So when I wanted to go into the physical therapy profession, I wanted to do things to give back to the community. And this is some ways that we're doing that. So I'm excited for tonight and for future seminars coming up. But what we wanted to do with kind of these seminars here is really provide you guys as the running community with some good quality information. There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet and a lot of different things about running in general, about injuries and training and different philosophies. And what we wanted to provide for you guys is some good quality information and really the opportunity to interact a little bit with us as the therapists and some of the coaches and the guys at Runners Roost. So that's kind of the goals for the seminar here. And tonight we're talking about treadmill running versus over ground running, or outdoor versus indoor running. We get a lot of questions about this in the clinic, about the differences between the two. Probably at least once a week I do, just the difference, if you should be running inside versus outside and what the differences are. So we decided to really dive into some of the research and see what exactly the differences are and talk about that. So before we begin to talk about the differences, with research we always got to talk about the differences, or not the differences, the reason why we do it, why we do a research for anything. And so most of the research for this topic, for the differences, is really research for other research. A lot of shoe companies are going to do studies for orthotics in their shoes, and they do their tests on a treadmill, but they need to know how much carryover there is to overground running. So if a shoe company has, they come up with a shoe and they do these tests and they find out, give someone happy feet on a treadmill, they need to know how much they can generalize that to overground running. And so they do these studies to see if they can do that. Or more realistically, it's like when they study orthotics and shoes and see how it changes the position of the ankles and the knees and the feet. But they need to also study how it interacts over ground versus on a treadmill. There's also some training implications between the two. I think as runners, we're always looking for an edge and finding out if we eat this or how that affects our training. So treadmill running is definitely a big part of that. And then in my profession, it's about the potential injuries between the two. I guess a big example that Brad and I were talking about is that if we get a streak of really bad weather, people will do a lot of the training inside. It's not so bad this winter, but like last winter, when if you ask my wife Abby, she'll say that there's snow on the ground until July and she couldn't run outside. But if we get a streak of bad weather, like in January, December when it's dark out, it's cold, people are doing a lot of their miles inside. They'll put in like a month of training just indoors, and then it'll be nice, it'll be in the 60s and 70s like today, and they'll hit the trails and do a lot of hill running. And then they come back the next day, they'll be like, man, my hamstrings, my calves are just killing me. What's going on? I've been running consistently, I've been running real well, all of a sudden I'm real tight and sore. And so there could be a lot of just implications from the treadmill doing that. Nice, it worked. So first off, I want to talk about a little bit about the biomechanics of the anatomy and running itself. We all have just different levels of background, different levels of understanding of the human body. So I just wanted to kind of level the playing field and so we all understand some of the biomechanics so we can really appreciate some of the studies coming up. The first one is that muscles only pull. this is kind of a funny story. I went to University of Colorado and I had a biomechanics class years ago. And the first day the biomechanics professor came in, he had the whole first lecture on how muscles only pull. All 90 minutes about how muscles only pull. And it's kind of funny, I put these slides together last week. And last Friday I went to a seminar on cycling at CSU was putting on. And my professor, my biomechanics professor was there. I haven't seen him in 7 years. All of a sudden I see him. And so after the seminar we talked, and I'm like, Dr. Crom, I got to tell you, I was in your class 7 years ago, and I still remember this lecture about how muscles only pull. I'm doing this talk next week, and I'm going to include that. He got so excited. He talked for about 20 minutes how muscles only pull. And so he does this. He still does this lecture to this day. First lecture of every biomechanics class is about how muscles only pull. So they pull on tendons, which pull on the bone, which create a movement. So really any type of walking and running, any type of movement, just a complex series of levers and pulleys. And you'll see why that's kind of important coming up. And also muscles work in 3 ways: concentrically, eccentrically, and isometrically. Concentric is the typical muscle shortens to create a movement which shortens the angle of the joint. Eccentrically is where it tightens and lengthens at the same time. And then isometrically is just where it holds in one spot. So it's tensed, but it's not moving. Okay. And then also running and walking speed. So the velocity of running is determined by stride length times stride frequency. So with these studies, when they're comparing over the ground versus treadmill, they want to keep as many variables the same as they can. And so oftentimes they'll keep it the same speed, so have the person run the same speed. And most often one of these variables change, and they have to change inversely. So if your stride length decreases, then the frequency has to increase to maintain the same speed. And that'll come into play a little later on. Now, before I go on, I have a patient. She's a major in public speaking at CSU. And so I'm just trying to get on her to give me some tips for this. And she said that one of the biggest things is give you guys the opportunity to ask questions as we go. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand or shout it out, and we'll talk about it. Also, I want to talk about the different phases of running, because this will become important when we're looking at the two. So running and walking can be broken down into all these different phases. First one is kind of a weight acceptance phase, where it's the initial contact, where I initially contact my heel or the midfoot, and a loading response where I start to transfer all my weight on the leg. Single limb support is where I go through a mid stance, a terminal stance, and then it's a pre-swing where my heel comes up. And then this phase of swing phase when my leg is just flying through the air. So kind of a mid-swing, terminal swing, and the initial swing at the beginning. And so when we look at the difference between running on treadmill and over ground, we look at these different phases of gait. And then also, so running the requirements. This guy, I think it's Matthew Walsh. I came across this and I really liked how he described the different requirements for running. And he kind of came up with these 3 main requirements that I think are important. One is that we have to have the ability to support our weight on one leg. And really, when they do these ground reaction force studies, they'll find that we have to support 2 to 3 times their body weight on one leg when we go into that initial contact and the loading response. And so a guy like me around 175 pounds, that's around 500 pounds that my single leg has to absorb through my muscles and my joints and things like that. We also need the power to propel our body forward. Otherwise, we're not going to move anywhere. We need to be going somewhere. Then we also need to have the ability to advance our swing leg forward. Otherwise, again, it's just going to be like a shuffle. So now we're at the differences here. So what a lot of researchers agree upon is that there is some kind of difference. A lot of them won't agree on what exactly it is, but I kind of picked out the most common ones, the most agreed upon ones. And we'll go through each one of these in the slides come up. One's the change in stride length that we take on as we're running. One's the effects of the treadmill belt itself on muscle firing and the angle of our hips and our joints. There's some skeletal impact differences, some metabolic differences between the two, and the environmental differences. So the change in stride length, this is a big one it's agreed upon most researchers that do these studies. And that when we're on a treadmill, compared to our overground running, we take a shorter stride. So when we go back to this stride length times stride frequency equation to find our velocity, we keep the speed the same, but we take shorter strides, the frequency goes up. So we're taking these shorter, quicker strides on the treadmill compared to overground. And this, they attribute mostly to the environment of the treadmill. We're on this kind of narrow belt, the bars on either end, this thing with buttons and lights, and then that black thing right in front that you think you're going to step on with each step. And so we take on the shorter, just cautious gait. And also, in a few slides, we'll find that our vertical displacement is less. So we're taking these shorter, quicker strides, and we're getting off the ground less. And again, that's attributed to just the environment of the treadmill. And the big thing with this is that it increases our hamstring activity when we're running on a treadmill. So one of the major jobs of the hamstring when we're running, so my hamstring, this muscle back here, is to slow my lower leg from going forward during the swing phase. So when I'm pushing off, if we're looking at my right leg here, it's swinging forward, it eccentrically contracts to go forward, to slow me down. So if I'm taking these quicker, shorter steps, it's going to be working a lot more. And so that's the big difference with the change in the stride length here. And now there's the effect of the treadmill belt, and this is the big one. The big thing with the treadmill belt is that the belt itself is moving my leg backwards for me. So the big thing with this, again, is when I'm running over ground, my big glute muscle back here, my glute max, a little bit of my hamstrings, is concentrically engaging to pull my leg back and to push my leg forward. So if I'm on a treadmill, pick my foot up, the belt pulls me back, pulls my leg back for me. So over ground, using glute muscle, hamstring to propel me forward, pull the leg back. In this Frischberg article, back in 1983, this is one of the first biggest studies on the differences between the two. And so every study since then has cited this Frischberg article, but he hypothesized that he found a pretty dramatic decrease in energy costs on treadmill running versus over ground. And he attributed it to this treadmill belt pulling the leg back, and so we're decreasing that muscle activity. And we'll talk about that a little bit more further on here. And then also, this is as the belt brings my leg back, I go into more hip extension in my leg. So if we look at my hip angle right here, this belt is pulling my leg back further than it would if I was over ground running. So we go into more hip extension, which requires my hip flexor to pick it up and push it down. So it's working a little bit more because it works through a greater range. And so the big implication of this is if I have a tight hip capsule or a tight hip flexor, as the belt pulls my leg back, if it's tight in my pelvis here, it's going to pull my pelvis anteriorly and create a lot of lumbar extension. So if I'm running on the treadmill, tight hip flexor, tight hip capsule, I'm going into a lot of lumbar extension. And so this is going to cause me to use my lumbar muscles a lot and could create some fatigue there and potential back pain. So if you see those people out on the treadmill, they're running really just upright running, they're probably doing that a little bit less over ground. And so again, with the belt pulling the leg back, decreases the need for the butt muscle, decreases hamstring activity during that phase of the running, increases that hip flexor activity. And then also the ability for the calf muscle to push off. So when I'm running through my gait on a treadmill here, my hip flexors pick my leg up to swing it forward, and also my calf muscles push off to achieve this swing phase. And so when the belt's moving back, there's not that steady surface to push off from. When I'm over ground running, I have a cement or a relatively stable trail to run on. So I'm able to push off with my calf muscle and achieve a good swing phase. On the belt's moving back, so I kind of put the analogy, it's like running on ice or like on mud, where you can't get that good traction. So the calf muscles actually have to work harder to achieve that push off. And so that's why when you get off the treadmill, you feel like you got a spring in your step, or you feel like you're power walking, because their muscles are so activated, they're so used to being activated on the treadmill, they want to keep going when you get on hard land. Then also there's a study, I think it is the Bauer study, that found that there's a decrease in peroneal activity. So a little muscle on the side of our shin here, slight decrease in activity on that in treadmill versus over ground. And they attribute that to the kind of stable environment in the treadmill versus over ground.